The sun was setting slowly over the quiet little town where Frank lived. Frank was an elderly mechanic, a man who had spent his whole life surrounded by engines, grease, and the smell of oil. His small garage sat on the edge of town, with an old faded sign that barely hung straight anymore. The building looked tired, just like its owner. Still, Frank showed up every single morning, opened the doors, and worked until his back ached. Fixing cars was more than just a job to him. It was his way of life, his passion, and in some ways, his only connection to the world outside his small home. Frank was not a rich man. His garage was filled with tools that had been with him for decades. Some of them were so old that the metal handles had worn smooth from his hands. Many people in town often wondered why Frank never retired. He was already in his 70s, and most men his age had long left work behind. But Frank loved what he did, and he always said the same thing whenever someone asked him about quitting: engines keep me young. If I stop, I'll rust just like an old car. That particular evening, Frank was finishing up work on a dusty old pickup truck. His hands were blackened with grease, and he wiped them on a rag that looked as tired as he was. Just as he was about to close for the day, he heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. The engine coughed a little as if it had something stuck inside. Frank stepped out and saw a sleek black car, clearly expensive, rolling slowly toward his garage. The driver's side door opened, and a tall man stepped out. He was dressed simply, in jeans and a plain shirt. He didn't wear fancy clothes, and there was nothing about him that shouted wealth or fame. He gave a polite smile and walked over to Frank. "Evening, sir," the man said kindly. "I think my car's having some trouble. Can you take a look?" Frank nodded, sizing him up the way old men do when they meet someone new. "Sure, bring it in," he said, his voice rough but gentle. He guided the man to drive the car into the garage. The vehicle purred but struggled, and Frank could hear the problem before he even touched it. "What's your name, son?" Frank asked as he leaned under the hood. "Keanu," the man replied, his tone soft and humble. Frank only gave a small nod. He didn't recognize the name, nor did he realize he was standing next to one of the most famous actors in the world. To him, Keanu was just another man with car trouble. Frank bent over the engine, his practiced eyes moving quickly, his hands steady even though his joints sometimes hurt. Keanu stood nearby, watching as the old mechanic worked. There was something almost poetic about the way Frank moved, slow but sure, every turn of the wrench filled with experience. It was clear this man had done this thousands of times in his life. His face was worn, lined with years of hard work, but there was a calmness about him. "You've been doing this a long time, haven't you?" Keanu asked after a moment. Frank gave a little chuckle without looking up. "All my life. I started fixing bicycles when I was a boy, then tractors, then cars. Haven't stopped since." Keanu smiled. He liked how Frank spoke. There was no show-off attitude, no rush. Just a man who cared about his work. "Do you ever get tired of it?" Frank finally looked up at him, his eyes shining behind his glasses. "Son, when you love something, you don't get tired. My body might complain, but my heart doesn't. Cars tell me stories, you know. Each problem is a mystery, and I like solving it." Keanu nodded slowly. He wasn't used to being treated like just another person. Normally, people recognized him instantly, asked for photos, or acted differently around him. But here, in this small garage, Keanu felt almost invisible in the best way possible. Frank didn't care who he was. He only cared about fixing the car. After a few minutes of silence, Frank found the issue. He tightened a few bolts, replaced a small part from his shelf, and wiped his hands. "There you go. She'll run smooth now," he said, patting the hood of the car. Keanu started the engine, and sure enough, the car purred beautifully, no longer struggling. His face lit up with gratitude. That's amazing. Thank you so much. How much do I owe you? Frank shook his head and waved a hand. It's a small job. Just give me $50, and we'll call it even. Keanu blinked in surprise. For a car like his, in most garages, the bill would have been several $100s, maybe more. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few extra bills. That doesn't seem fair. Please, take more. You deserve it. But Frank held up his hand firmly. No, son. I'm not here to empty your wallet. I fix cars to keep people safe. That's enough for me. 50 will do. For a moment, Keanu didn't know what to say. In Hollywood, people often charged more just because they knew who he was. Yet here was this old man, refusing extra money, refusing to take advantage. There was something deeply refreshing about that. He slowly tucked the extra bills back into his pocket and handed Frank the agreed amount. As he prepared to leave, Keanu looked around the garage. The place was old and worn out. The walls had peeling paint, and the tools looked like they had seen better days. He noticed Frank's slight limp as he walked back to his workbench. He thought about how many years this man had worked like this, with little reward, but still smiling as if it was the best life one could ask for. Before stepping into his car, Keanu said softly, "You're a good man." "Thank you, truly." Frank just smiled, wiping his hands again with his rag. "Drive safe now," he said, waving him off like he would any other customer. Keanu drove away, but his mind was not on the road, it was on Frank. Something about that encounter touched him deeply. The humility, the kindness, the honesty, it was rare to find someone like that in the world, and Keanu couldn't stop thinking about it. Back at the garage, Frank closed the doors and locked up for the night. He was tired, his back hurt, and his hands were sore. But as he walked home, he felt content. He didn't know that the stranger he had just helped was a world-famous star. He didn't know that his small act of honesty would soon bring something into his life he never expected. The next morning, Frank woke up early, just like he did every day. His routine never changed. He made himself a cup of black coffee, ate a piece of toast, and then slowly walked to his little garage at the edge of town. His knees were stiff, his back complained, but his spirit stayed strong. He often told himself that as long as he could still lift a wrench, he was not too old to work. The garage was not just a place for fixing cars, it was his second home, a place filled with memories of his younger years, laughter of old friends, and the lessons life had taught him. That day, he thought about the polite stranger named Keanu who had come in the evening before. Frank still did not know who he was. He only remembered how kind the man's eyes looked, how grateful he seemed when his car started again. To Frank, he was just another traveler, maybe a man from the city who got stuck on his way. Frank had seen hundreds of faces come and go over the years, but there was something calm about that one. He didn't dwell on it much, though. His workbench was waiting, and so were the cars lined up outside. Meanwhile, Keanu was back in the city. The night after Frank fixed his car, Keanu couldn't shake off the feeling of admiration he had for the old mechanic. Hollywood was a world full of noise, parties, flashing cameras, money, and people who often pretended to be what they were not. But Frank had been so real, so simple, and so honest. He had charged only $50 for a repair that could have cost 5 times more. And when Keanu had tried to give him more, the old man had refused. That kind of humility was rare. It reminded Keanu of the lessons his own family had taught him long ago, lessons about kindness, fairness, and dignity in work. In the garage, Frank was busy fixing a neighbor's old farm truck. The engine had been giving trouble for weeks, but Frank had finally managed to track down the problem. As he leaned over the hood, his hands working with the same steady rhythm, a group of local teenagers passed by. One of them laughed and said, "Frank, You'll never stop fixing these old things, will you? Frank smiled and replied, as long as they keep running, I'll keep fixing. The teenagers laughed, shook their heads, and walked away. To them, Frank was just the old man with greasy hands. But inside, Frank knew that every car he fixed kept someone's family safe, kept someone's life moving forward. That was his reward. Back in his hotel room, Keanu sat quietly with a notebook. He often wrote his thoughts when something touched him deeply. That evening, he scribbled down a few lines about Frank, a man who gives more than he takes. A man who works not for fame, not for money, but because he loves what he does. A man who refuses extra even when he needs it. That is true wealth. As the week went on, Keanu shared the story of Frank with a few close friends. They were surprised to hear about such a mechanic, a man who didn't even recognize Keanu Reeves standing in his garage. You mean he had no idea who you were? One of them asked. Keanu laughed softly. Not at all. And that's what made it so beautiful. He looked at me like a human being, not like a star. His friends nodded, understanding the quiet meaning behind his words. Back in town, Frank continued with his days. He lived alone in a small house. His wife had passed away years earlier, and his children lived far away in other states. They called him once in a while, but Frank never wanted to bother them with his struggles. He had always been independent, always proud of standing on his own feet. The garage gave him purpose, and though money was often tight, he managed. He never wanted more than what he had. That week, Frank faced small challenges. The roof of the garage leaked when it rained, his tools sometimes broke, and his old truck barely started in the mornings. But Frank never complained. He believed life gave everyone burdens, and the only thing that mattered was how you carried them. When customers came, he greeted them with a smile, fixed their cars with honesty, and charged only what was fair. Some thought he was foolish for not asking more, but Frank didn't care. He had never measured his life in dollars. One afternoon, as Frank was sweeping the floor of his garage, he remembered something his father used to say. A man's worth is not in what he owns, but in what he gives. Frank smiled at the memory. He had lived by those words his whole life, even if it meant going without many things others enjoyed. Keanu, on the other hand, was haunted by the sight of Frank's old garage. He kept remembering the rusty tools, the peeling paint, the flickering light bulb above the workbench. He thought about how hard it must be for Frank to keep going at his age. Yet the man had refused to take more money. That kind of pride in honest work struck Keanu deeply. It reminded him of his own struggles before fame when he too had lived in small apartments, worked odd jobs, and learned the value of humility. Over the next few days, Keanu made calls quietly. He asked his team to help him find a way to return to Frank's town without drawing too much attention. He didn't want this to be about publicity. He didn't want cameras just for the sake of news. He wanted to do something truly meaningful for Frank, something that would honor the man's quiet dedication. As the days passed, Frank remained unaware. He had no idea that the stranger he helped was planning to come back. To him, it was just another week of fixing cars, helping neighbors, and living quietly. Yet little did he know, his honesty had touched a man whose face was known across the world. Keanu's heart felt restless. He knew he couldn't just let this go. Frank had given him more than just a car repair, he had given him a reminder of goodness in a world that often forgot what it meant. Keanu decided that he would not let that goodness go unnoticed. And so, as the week came to an end, two lives moved on in different rhythms. One, an old man in a quiet town, living with little but content in his heart. The other, a world-famous actor, living in the noise of fame but carrying the memory of a mechanic who worked with dignity. Their paths had crossed once by chance, but fate was preparing to bring them together again, this time, in a way Frank could never imagine. A week passed quietly in Frank's little town. For him, Each day looked almost the same, but he never complained. He rose early, stretched his aching back, brewed his coffee, and walked down the street to open his garage. The old sign outside still squeaked in the wind, and the smell of oil and rust welcomed him every morning. His neighbors often waved at him as they passed, and though he was never the kind of man to seek attention, everyone knew him as the honest mechanic who never cheated anyone. Life moved slowly, but it was steady, and that was enough for Frank. During that week, Frank spent his time helping people from town. He fixed a teacher's car that had broken down on the way to school. He repaired an old farmer's tractor, knowing the man couldn't afford to pay much. He even checked the brakes on a young mother's van for free because he worried about her safety. That was Frank, always thinking about others before himself. He never realized that his simple acts of kindness were the kind of things that changed lives. To him, it was just doing what was right. But far away in the city, Keanu's thoughts were still stuck in that small garage. He had returned to his busy schedule: meetings, scripts, calls, and events, but none of it felt as real as that quiet evening he spent watching Frank work. Hollywood was full of polished sets and bright lights, but in Frank's garage, there had been no pretending, no cameras, no show. Just an old man with greasy hands, fixing a car because he cared. Keanu kept remembering Frank's words, "I'm not here to empty your wallet. I fix cars to keep people safe." Those words had stayed with him like an echo. One night, after finishing a long day of work, Keanu sat alone in his apartment. He looked out at the city lights but felt no joy in them. Instead, he thought of Frank, bent over that car engine, his hands steady despite his age. Keanu thought about the old tools, the peeling paint, and the way Frank had limped slightly when he walked. He thought about how easily the world overlooked people like Frank, quiet, hard-working souls who never asked for recognition. Keanu felt something stir in his heart. He couldn't just let this man fade into memory. He had to do something. The next morning, Keanu picked up his phone and made a call to his assistant. "I need you to help me find a small garage in a little town," he said. "It belongs to a mechanic named Frank. I met him last week when he fixed my car." His assistant was surprised but didn't question it. Keanu was known for his kindness and unusual requests, and this was just another example of his heart leading him. As his team began searching, Keanu thought more about why this mattered so much to him. In his career, he had met thousands of people, from the richest businessmen to the poorest fans. He had seen people treat him differently because of his fame, some with admiration, others with jealousy. But Frank hadn't cared who he was. Frank had looked at him as a human being, not as a celebrity. And in that moment, Keanu had felt something rare. He had felt seen not for his fame but for his humanity. That was worth more than all the applause in the world. Meanwhile, Frank's life went on as usual. He didn't know that the man he had helped was Keanu Reeves. He didn't know that his story was already being quietly shared among Keanu's close friends. He didn't know that plans were being made that would soon change his life. All Frank knew was that his garage was still standing, his customers still trusted him, and his work still gave him purpose. On the third day of the week, Frank sat on a wooden stool during his lunch break. He had only a sandwich and a cup of tea, but he ate it with quiet satisfaction. Looking around his garage, he noticed again how old and broken everything seemed: the leaking roof, the flickering light bulb, the shelves full of dusty tools. He sighed but smiled anyway. "As long as they still work, I'll keep going," he whispered to himself. At the same time, Keanu's assistant called him back with good news. "We found it," she said. "There's a small garage on the edge of town, run by an elderly mechanic named Frank. That matches what you described." Keanu felt a wave of relief. "Good," he said. "Now I want to go back there. But I don't want it to be just me showing up empty-handed. I want to do something meaningful." He thought carefully about what Frank might truly need. Money was easy to give, but Keanu knew that Frank was not the kind of man who cared about wealth. He had refused extra cash before, and giving him more would only embarrass him. No, this had to be something that honored Frank's work and spirit. After long thought, Keanu came up with an idea. He decided he would return to Frank's garage with new tools, fresh equipment, and maybe even repairs for the garage itself. He wanted to give Frank back the dignity of working with ease, without struggling with broken machines or worn-out wrenches. He wanted the garage to reflect the pride Frank carried in his heart. To make it even more special, Keanu considered bringing a small film crew to capture the moment, not for his own fame, but to inspire others by Frank's story. By the 5th day of the week, plans were already in motion. Keanu had arranged for a delivery of professional-grade tools and equipment. He spoke to a local contractor to touch up the garage's structure. And most importantly, he prepared himself to return personally, to look Frank in the eye and thank him again, not as a famous actor, but as a man grateful to another man. Back in the small town, Frank was ending another long day. He leaned on his workbench, tired but content, wiping his hands with his rag. He had no idea that his quiet world was about to be shaken. He had no idea that the stranger he had helped was thinking of him day and night. He had no idea that his small act of humility was about to bring him into the spotlight in a way he never expected. The week that had seemed ordinary to Frank had been extraordinary to Keanu. For Frank, life was simple: fix the cars, earn an honest living, go home. For Keanu, that same week was filled with restless thoughts, plans, and determination to honor a man who had reminded him of something precious, the beauty of humility and kindness. By the 7th day, the paths of the two men were set to cross again. Frank closed his garage as usual, walking home with his shoulders bent from age but his spirit still strong. Far away, Keanu Reeves sat in his car, looking at a map of the little town, ready to drive back. His heart was calm but excited. He knew this wasn't just about fixing a car anymore. It was about fixing something deeper, the way the world sometimes forgot to value its quiet heroes. And so, as the new week began, two lives that had touched briefly were about to meet again. Only this time, it would not be a simple repair job. This time, it would be a moment that would surprise Frank, move Keanu, and inspire everyone who heard the story. The following Monday morning started out like any other day for Frank. The town was quiet, the streets almost empty except for a few early workers heading to their jobs. Frank walked slowly toward his garage with his worn lunchbox in hand. His back ached more than usual that morning, but he didn't complain. At his age, pain was like an old friend that came along for the ride. He pushed open the rusty garage doors, switched on the weak yellow light bulbs, and inhaled the familiar smell of grease, rubber, and gasoline. To Frank, this was home. He set down his lunchbox, put on his apron, and started checking the schedule for the day. He had a few cars lined up: Mrs. Wilson's old sedan, which always seemed to have brake problems, and a delivery van that needed its tires replaced. He didn't expect anything unusual. It was supposed to be just another day in his simple life. But outside town, a line of sleek cars was slowly making its way toward his little garage. At the front of the convoy was Keanu Reeves, sitting quietly in the passenger seat of a black SUV. He looked out the window at the countryside rolling by, feeling both nervous and excited. He wasn't nervous about meeting Frank again. He knew the old man would welcome him kindly. What made him nervous was whether Frank would accept his gift. Keanu had spent the past week planning everything with his team. He had ordered brand new equipment, from shiny toolboxes to powerful repair machines. He had arranged for contractors to repair the garage's roof, repaint the walls, and even install proper lighting. He had done all this not to show off but because he wanted Frank's work to be respected the way Frank respected it. Behind the SUV, trucks carried boxes of tools, spare parts, and fresh paint. A small group of people followed: friends, colleagues, and even a quiet camera crew. Keanu hadn't wanted to make it about publicity, but one of his close friends convinced him that sharing Frank's story could inspire millions of people around the world. Keanu agreed only on one condition: the cameras would stay respectful, no bright lights, no shouting, no drama. It had to stay real, just like Frank. Back in the garage, Frank was tightening a bolt on the delivery van's wheel when he heard an unusual sound outside. It wasn't the familiar rumble of old cars or trucks. This was something smoother, stronger. Curious, he straightened up and wiped his forehead with his rag. Through the open door, he saw several black cars slowly pulling into the yard. His first thought was that maybe some important businessmen had gotten lost. It wasn't every day that expensive vehicles stopped at his humble shop. The doors opened, and to Frank's surprise, out stepped the same man he had met a week earlier, the quiet, polite fellow named Keanu. He was dressed simply again, jeans and a plain shirt, but this time there was no mistaking the presence he carried. Something about the way everyone around him moved showed that he was no ordinary man. Frank walked out, confused but smiling. "Well, look who it is," he said warmly. "Your car giving you trouble again?" Keanu laughed softly and shook his hand. "No, not this time. I came back because I wanted to see you." Frank raised an eyebrow. "See me? For what?" Before Keanu could answer, one of the trucks behind him opened its doors, and workers began unloading shiny red toolboxes, shelves of brand new equipment, and neatly packed boxes of car parts. Frank's eyes widened as he watched. The men carried the items into his garage, lining them up one by one. The old, tired space suddenly began to fill with life, with color, with possibility. "Hold on a minute," Frank said, holding up his hand. "What's all this? I didn't order anything." Keanu looked at him with a kind smile. "You didn't?" "I did. This is for you, Frank. Consider it a gift." Frank shook his head quickly. "No, no, son. I can't accept all this. It's too much. I don't need fancy things. My old tools still work just fine." But Keanu stepped closer, his voice calm and gentle. "Frank, you've been fixing cars with the same tools for decades. You help people without asking for more than what's fair. You keep this town moving. You deserve better. This isn't about making your garage fancy, it's about giving you the respect you've earned." For the first time, Frank felt his throat tighten. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of generosity. He was always the one helping others. He looked at the shiny new equipment and then back at Keanu. "Why would you do this for me?" he asked quietly. Keanu took a deep breath. "Because a week ago, you reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. You reminded me that kindness and honesty are what matter most in this world. You didn't care who I was. You didn't charge me extra. You treated me like a human being, not like a celebrity. And that meant more to me than I can explain. So now, I just want to give something back." As the workers continued to unload the supplies, a few townspeople gathered outside, curious about the scene. They whispered among themselves, recognizing the famous actor now standing in front of their neighbor's garage. Phones came out, pictures were taken, but everything stayed calm. They were too stunned to do anything more than watch. Frank stood there, still overwhelmed. "You're telling me, you're that actor everyone talks about? The one in the movies?" Keanu chuckled and nodded. "Yes, I am. But when I came here last week, I wasn't an actor. I was just a man with a broken car, and you treated me like that. That's why I'll always be grateful to you." The old mechanic didn't know what to say. His hands trembled slightly as he leaned on his rag. He wasn't used to cameras, he wasn't used to crowds, and he certainly wasn't used to someone like Keanu Reeves standing in his garage, calling him an inspiration. One of the workers brought in a brand new hydraulic lift to replace the old jack Frank had been using for years. Another carried in a rolling toolbox filled with every kind of wrench and screwdriver imaginable. A third brought in new lights that would brighten the dim garage. Piece by piece, the shop was transformed before Frank's eyes. Finally, Keanu turned back to him and said softly, "This is just the beginning, Frank. There's more outside." Frank frowned in disbelief. "More?" Keanu nodded and motioned toward the driveway. A car cover was pulled back, revealing a shining new sedan parked under the sunlight. Its paint gleamed, and its engine purred like a dream. Frank gasped. What's this?" "It's yours," Keanu said simply. "Not to replace your garage work. This is for you. So you can drive in comfort, after all the years you've spent making sure everyone else is safe on the road." Frank covered his mouth with his hand. Tears filled his eyes. He had never owned a new car in his life. Every vehicle he had ever driven was second-hand, patched together just enough to run. To see something brand new, handed to him as a gift, was almost too much for his heart to take. By now, half the town had gathered around, clapping and cheering. Some even shouted, "You deserve it, Frank." Others wiped their own eyes at the sight. The humble mechanic who had lived in their town for decades was finally being recognized in a way he never expected. Frank finally turned to Keanu and whispered, "I don't know how to thank you." Keanu put a hand on his shoulder. "You already did, Frank. You thanked me the day you refused to take more money. You thanked me when you fixed my car with honesty and care. All I'm doing is returning the favor." For a moment, the two men stood there in silence, one a world-famous actor, the other an old mechanic from a small town. Yet in that moment, they were simply two human beings, connected by respect and kindness. And as the cameras quietly captured the scene, the world was about to learn about Frank's story, the story of an elderly mechanic who reminded Keanu Reeves, and soon millions of others, that true greatness lies not in fame or fortune, but in humility, honesty, and heart. Frank stood frozen in the middle of his little garage, surrounded by shiny new tools, bright lights, and the sound of townspeople cheering. It felt like a dream, one of those rare moments that didn't feel real until you pinched yourself. His old heart beat faster than usual, his hands trembled slightly, and tears filled his tired eyes. He had lived more than 70 years, and never in all that time had he imagined that something like this would happen to him. The townspeople crowded around the doorway, clapping, smiling, and calling out his name. They had always respected Frank, but they had grown so used to his quiet ways that they sometimes forgot just how much he had given to the community. Now, watching Keanu Reeves himself honor their old mechanic, they realized that Frank was more than just a man who fixed cars. He was a symbol of honesty, humility, and service. Frank tried to speak, but his voice cracked. I I don't deserve all this," he muttered, shaking his head. Keanu placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Yes, you do, Frank. You've spent your whole life giving. This is your turn to receive." For a moment, there was only silence, except for the sound of the wind rattling the garage sign. Then someone in the crowd shouted, "Speech, Frank. Give us a speech." The others laughed and clapped again, encouraging him. Frank, who had never been much of a speaker, looked around nervously. He wasn't used to attention, certainly not this kind. But as he glanced at the faces of his neighbors, the teacher whose car he had fixed for almost nothing, the farmer whose tractor he had kept running, the young mother whose brakes he had checked free of charge, he felt a warmth in his chest. These were his people, and maybe they deserved to hear his heart. So he cleared his throat, rubbed his hands on his apron, and began. "I've been fixing cars all my life," he said slowly, his voice rough but steady. "Not because it makes me rich, not because it makes me important. I've done it because it keeps people safe, and because it's what I know best. I never expected to be noticed for it. Truth is, I'm just a man with some tools and a love for engines. He paused, his eyes glistening. But today you've shown me something I never thought I'd see. You've shown me that kindness doesn't go unnoticed. That maybe even the smallest acts matter. I don't know what to say, except thank you from the bottom of my heart. The crowd erupted in applause. Some wiped away tears. Keanu nodded respectfully, deeply moved by the simple honesty in Frank's words. There was no drama, no performance, just truth, spoken from a man who had lived it. After the small speech, Keanu led Frank outside to the new car again. The sun caught the paint and made it shine like glass. Frank walked around it slowly, running his hand along the smooth surface. I've never had anything brand new before, he whispered, almost to himself. Keanu smiled. Well, now you do. And it's yours. No strings attached. Frank laughed softly, though it sounded more like a sob. I don't even know if I'll be able to drive something this fine. I'm used to old trucks that cough and sputter. That's exactly why you deserve it, Keanu replied warmly. As the day went on, workers finished setting up the garage. The dull, dim space became almost unrecognizable. New lights glowed bright and steady. Fresh paint covered the peeling walls. Shelves were organized, tools gleamed, and the hydraulic lift stood proudly in the center like a throne for cars. It looked less like an old man's shop now and more like a professional workshop worthy of any city. The townspeople were amazed. It's like a brand new garage, one said. Frank, you'll be working here another 20 years with this setup. Frank chuckled. If my bones let me, he replied. Before leaving, Keanu quietly pulled Frank aside. Away from the cameras and the crowd, he looked him in the eyes and spoke softly. Frank, I want you to know something. You may think you're just a small-town mechanic, but to me, you're a reminder of the kind of world I want to live in. A world where people care about each other, where honesty is enough, and where kindness is never wasted. Don't ever think you're ordinary. You're extraordinary. Frank had no reply. His eyes brimmed with tears, and he simply nodded, patting Keanu's hand like a father would to a son. When the cars finally left and the crowd went home, Frank stood alone in his new garage, staring at everything that had changed in a single day. The tools, the lights, the car, it all felt overwhelming. But deep inside, what moved him most wasn't the gifts themselves. It was the fact that someone had seen him, truly seen him, and valued him for what he was. That night, when he walked home, people along the way stopped to shake his hand. We're proud of you, Frank, they said. Children waved at him. Neighbors who had passed him by without much thought before now looked at him with admiration. Frank felt shy under all the attention, but he also felt a strange happiness. For once in his life, his simple work had been recognized not just as labor, but as love. In the days that followed, news of the story spread. A video of Keanu surprising Frank went viral online. Millions of people watched as the old mechanic stood in shock, receiving his new garage and car. Comments poured in from around the world. Strangers wrote things like, "This brought tears to my eyes," and "We need more Franks in the world." Frank's little garage in a quiet town had suddenly become famous. Reporters called, magazines wrote articles, and television hosts talked about the story. But Frank stayed the same. He still opened his garage every morning. He still charged fair prices, still refused to overcharge anyone, and still wiped his greasy hands on his old rag. Fame didn't change him, because he never cared about fame in the first place. He cared about people. One afternoon, a young boy came into his shop with a broken bicycle. Frank knelt down and fixed it, just like he had fixed hundreds before. The boy's eyes sparkled with excitement. "You're the man from the video," he said. Frank chuckled. "I'm just Frank, son. And your bike is ready to ride." At home, he kept the new car parked carefully under a cover. He didn't drive it often, because he said it felt too nice for his everyday errands. But whenever he did, the whole town turned to watch, smiling proudly at their mechanic in his shiny gift. And as for Keanu, he carried Frank's story with him wherever he went. In interviews, when asked about fame or success, he would sometimes mention the humble mechanic who reminded him of what really mattered. Heroes aren't always on the screen, he once said. Sometimes, they're men like Frank, working quietly in small towns, making the world better one car at a time. For Frank, life continued in its simple rhythm. But it was no longer unnoticed. He had lived quietly for decades, thinking his work was small and ordinary. But that one act of kindness, refusing to take extra money from a stranger, had shown the world his true worth. And so, the elderly mechanic who once worked alone in a fading garage became a symbol far bigger than he ever imagined. His story touched millions, teaching them that humility, honesty, and kindness are the greatest treasures a person can give. Frank didn't need to be famous. He didn't need riches. What he had was enough: a pair of strong hands, a lifetime of work, and now, the knowledge that even the smallest act of goodness can echo across the world.